Hello everybody and welcome to FaithPoint Online. My name is Ben Trawick. I'm the campus pastor here at FaithPoint Online, and we are so glad that you are here joining us for church online tonight. We have kind of a special thing going on tonight. When we have an extra weekend in our release schedule, we get to have a FaithPoint Online Real Talk, where we have some conversation about maybe some other conversations that have been happening in the chat throughout Church Online over the past couple weeks, and that is specifically what we're doing tonight. Going to tackle some stuff, and I've got Chris Bishop here with me, lead pastor at FaithPoint United Methodist Church. I'm going to tell you a little bit about where we are and our special guest today.
Excellent. Yeah, so our Real Talk conversations, it's really fun to be able to kind of bring in some of those chat conversations into the conversation here. And so as we've been talking specifically about privilege, Ben and I didn't feel equipped to talk about privilege on our own. So we came back to my old seminary stomping grounds in DC at Wesley Theological Seminary to meet a buddy of mine to talk about this idea, understanding, and then how do we not just name but move forward in a healthy and positive way, centering around privilege and those privileges that we have. And so we're going to be meeting with the Associate Dean of Student Life here at Wesley, Asa Lee, and it's going to be a great conversation. So we are so glad that you guys are doing church with us, that we're having conversation. Keep those questions coming too, and like Ben said, some of those conversations spin off into direct conversations that happen here. So thank you guys.
Absolutely, yeah. Thanks again for being here. As we get started, just please create a nickname and jump into the chat as we go. This conversation is pre-recorded, so it's not actually happening live, so we won't be able to answer your questions live in the video, but we'll be in the chat. So if you have some questions or concerns or like just something you want to bring up, let's have more conversation in the chat as we go.
If you're feeling a call to seminary, I am sure that we can pass your information along to Asa and everybody else into the admissions office at Wesley, and they'll be happy to answer all of that.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. At the very least, you can join us in the chat. That's probably the easiest thing to do. But either way, so I'm not going to take up any more time. We're going to take a few minutes to get set up, and then we'll go ahead and get started.
Hey guys, well, welcome back. We are here with Dean Asa Lee. We are so excited that he is here to help us kind of navigate and give your perspective and expertise about our conversation that we've been having on the sidelines in the chat, and bringing that to the forefront with this, what we're labeling our Real Talk conversation. And as we kind of have been going through, just like every week, ask those questions that matter the most in the chat, but also remember that this is a safe space. So don't be a punk, right?
Yeah, that's right.
That's it.
It's a good thing.
So, and so we have been in the past few weeks talking about Wesley's 3 general rules of do no harm. Hence, you've got to be nice in the chat, do good, and then fall in love with God and what those ordinances are. But as we've been doing that, the sub-conversation has been what we understand, or what we've typically labeled as this understanding of privilege, or what that means. And so, Asa, I'm going to turn it over to you, though, because I want you to kind of give some perspective on what privilege is and how we might shape that conversation.
Okay, good. So, first of all, thanks for the invitation to join y'all. I think this is really an important and courageous opportunity to deal with hard things, something that the church ought to be doing, a place where that happens. Yeah. Part of what I've worked through in my years as an educator and teaching folks is that privilege is a hard word. For a lot of people, whether it be they're men or of a social economic status or of a sexual orientation or what have you, privilege kind of bristles because it suggests that I've got something, and when you ascribe it to me and I don't even know I have it, how am I privileged, right? So I've learned over the years to use, I think, a more effective word for what we're calling privilege, and that is bias. And for me, bias is something that we all have. It's a leaning, it's a natural tendency towards a particular thing. So in a very basic level, I have a bias towards French fries and anything home fries, potatoes. So if I come into the house and I hear a bag of chips, I'm gravitating towards it, right? And I have to work to be aware if I'm not supposed to be eating those things, right? And in the same way, as a man, as a person of a certain ethnic background, you have a bias. You grow up in a particular environment. You don't know it, but it's a part of who you are. And when you encounter something like it in a different setting, you gravitate toward it as well. And so it's a bias. It's a tendency toward it. It's neutral. I think that's the most important piece. In and of itself, it is neutral. But going back to the potatoes analogy, if I'm diabetic, my bias towards white potatoes means that it can be harmful, right, for me. And in the same way, biases in our society can be and inflict harm and can be harmful if we're not aware of how those biases are shaping our own actions or inactions in some respects. So if we're talking about race and ethnicity, our biases towards our own quote-unquote kind means that we are practicing a form of discrimination. We don't know it, we're not cognizant of it, but it's a bias. Calling you to the awareness of the bias then is the first step towards addressing that. I didn't mean to do it, but it's happening, and so how do I address that? Right. So I it's the same kind of language about privilege, but I see that my years in the classroom have taught me that privilege is a stumbling block, the word itself. Right. And it's more important for me for people to understand the concept, and I think bias is a way to get to that concept.
Right. Yeah, that's really interesting. So yeah, because you're talking about implicit bias, that bias that is learned and is so ingrained in us that we don't even know that it's there, and that it's affecting the way we make decisions and the way we treat other people. And the reason I really wanted to have this conversation was to put that kind of idea, that concept of implicit bias, next to these ideas of do no harm and do good, because when we decide what it is in the world around us that we, treat with respect and treat with equality so that we don't harm it, we don't often take the time to think about these biases that we hold that we may not even realize are there, that are affecting what we think harm is. Like it starts to get really difficult and really challenging without taking the time to recognize what those things are in our lives. Yeah, and so I wonder, for John Wesley, when he was coming up with these three rules, he was certainly in a time and in a space where there was all sorts of inequality going on. It was a very different era. So I just wonder what are the practices, the practical things that we can do as we move forward to recognize these biases in our lives that are so hard to identify, right?
Like you said, I had no idea. Like, my story is that I grew up in, kind of the rural, Frederick County out, and it was farmers and everybody who looked like me, and we now live fairly close to where I grew up, but as a family who is going through the process of adoption from Haiti, we have these conversations from folks that have the same bias as I have had growing up. Right. But some of those conversations of when we're mailing in stuff to, INS and to all of our adoption agencies, and the post office clerks are like, oh, what is this for? And then when you tell them, oh, it's going to be for an international adoption, they go, oh, right. Yeah. And then there's this like, But I think that you said the word bias is neutral,
right?
Because it's okay. So there's opportunity,
right?
And so so what do you see as some of those?
So I think, particularly from a Wesleyan perspective, the emphasis on grace, and I think again, bias allows for grace for self, right? So being able to really reflect on the fact that some of these things are just a part of who I am and how I was reared, and I shouldn't feel guilty for that, right? So when we hear privilege, it's just a lot. Well, you're trying to make me feel guilty about something that I didn't do, right? Well, that's not the goal. But bias is really the opportunity to say, here is my social location, here is my rearing, and I own it, right? But what does it mean for me to own it, and what are the implications of that for others in the world? And I think that's what's most important. And to the extent that my social location affects someone else negatively, right, that's to do no harm, right? And so how do I make myself aware of that? I think one of the most important things is to be willing to actually listen to the experiences of someone other than myself, right? I think what's going on right now related to Me Too, for all of us as men, the hard part of the Me Too movement is telling the stories that women are telling, but also the hard part is to receive those stories from our mothers, grandmothers, daughters. And while we may have never done anything ourselves, our bias is that that's not our experience.
Right.
And we don't know it. But I have to sit and live in the tension. And I think that's the real challenge for us, is that whenever we do this and we challenge our own biases, we've got to be willing to sit in the hard tension. Yeah. Right? And that it's hard work to actually sit and hear things that make us uncomfortable.
So like muting somebody on social media, or that natural knee jerk to change the channel or to write it off, like that is our. It seems like a natural tendency. This makes me uncomfortable, and there's a blessing in that tension to say,
it's counter to it. It counters our sense of protection, our self-protection, right? Yeah. But that's exactly what's called for in times of difficulty, is to sit and be made uncomfortable by what you hear, and then sometimes there is no response, right? There's nothing that can be said. Other times the response is, an apology, I know lately I've felt the strong urge to apologize for all men everywhere. But that's not my obligation, right? That's not what I'm supposed to do. My job is to sit and listen and just struggle. Same thing with issues of race, right? To the experience of white persons in this country are not the experiences of other folks in this country, and are white people supposed to apologize for everything that white persons have done for all time in history? No. And I don't think that's the expectation. It's to be heard, right? To hear the other person. So I think the patience and the courage to sit in the tension is probably one of the biggest challenges that we all have right now, because we can turn people off. We can block folks. We can, just act like they never existed.
Yeah, it's so easy to just throw those walls up with the way we communicate now. It's so easy to do. It's really interesting this isn't on our outline, but as we've been having the conversation, I've been thinking about one of the things that I have a 4-year-old at home, and one of the things we've been working really hard with him is when, he gets in trouble or he does something he should have done, he immediately goes into let's just hug, I love you, mommy and daddy, let's just get past that hurtful part, the part where it's uncomfortable, to the reconciliation. And we've been working really hard with him to kind of help him say hey, this is what happened, and it makes us uncomfortable. We're all uncomfortable right now, and that's okay, because we're going to learn from this. And it strikes me that, as adults, we still don't do that well in a lot of situations where we have this opportunity to sit in that tension, like you said, and regardless of what our response may be after we've spent some time there, is that in the midst of that, we will learn and grow, and we will learn empathy for the other people that are involved, whoever's on the other side of that argument or discussion or whatever it is. And
not many people do that well. It's something we all are still kind of working on, I think. I know me personally.
Yeah.
I'm not going to throw you guys in that boat, but I know that it's something that I struggle with. Yeah.
Yeah. I think I have a good friend who he's a pastor, and one of the things he has said, he's led some of the movements that have sort of done social protest around police violence in African American communities. And one of the things he said is, from a theological perspective, is that, if we're going to be like Christ, and we're going to try to be Christ-like in everything we do, one of the struggles we have to face is that even God required something before reconciliation, right? That whether it was an Old Testament offering, right, or the life of Jesus Christ himself was a requirement, particular theological view, before reconciliation was fully possible.
Right.
And so when we say that we're supposed to forgive or engage in reconciliation without hard work of sacrificing something, whether that sacrifice is our own idea of who we are, right? That's something that God didn't even do, right? That there's got to be some hard work, right, that takes place on the front end of that. And I think we all grow when that happens, right? When we're able to sort of say, you know what, I did do something wrong, or by virtue of my role in society, I have perpetuated something, and I didn't know that. Yeah. I think that's one of the very important pieces, is that in conversations around privilege and bias, is that it's the perpetuation of a system that is part of the problem. And that acknowledgement to say, my inhabiting this space means that I've perpetuated something, and I'm prepared to stop it.
Right.
And then asking that person or that group, how can I stop it from my location? I think is really important, because that leads you down those Wesleyan principles.
Right.
Don't hurt.
Right. Yeah. And it gives you the opportunity to engage and hear and listen, and not just, because too often, a lot of times we see people who want to help or want to be advocates for whatever group, but just assume they know what's best and jump in and start fixing things from the outside without making any attempt to understand, what the problem is, or what the most effective way is that they could help, like you were saying.
There was a few years back now, I worked with a high school track team, and that team is probably in our area the most diverse on so many different levels. And we had a conversation about what was happening with the Baltimore riots, and said, "Hey, is anybody talking to you guys about it?" And of course, teachers are not gonna touch that, right?
Yeah.
So they like to stay employed, and so all right. So I figured, well, I'm not really on staff; I'm a volunteer. You guys can let me go, whatever. And we had those types of conversations about engaging those biases in, like. My guys who were minorities were like, oh yeah, I've been treated differently, and guys that look like me are Caucasian kids are just like, no, never mind. And I said, but let's pause and say, all right, I'm not talking just negative,
right?
But also, have you and it was an interesting thing that when we were having those conversations and everyone was listening to one another, there were some pretty powerful connections that were made, or folks saying, I had no idea, on both sides, and that there was a cost or of lowering our defenses enough to say, these guys were literally on the same team. So
that's
like,
right. Well,
you got to be able, because you can't block or whatever. And it was interesting then, and it's been interesting in kind of the few years to follow, to see some of those lasting relationships where it's, if we would have just swept it under the rug, or if we would have just said, but Baltimore's a whole 50 miles away,
right?
That probably,
right.
And so, but then to talk about that from, socioeconomically and how we look at that, and rather than give guys grief about having to wear last year's uniforms, instead of being like, well, either don't do it or let's make sure everybody's got the same,
right?
There's good conversations.
That's a good example of the hard work leading to sort of the kind of good.
Yeah.
Right. The doing good that really does make a difference in the world, because there's a difference between just hearing the person and then saying, okay, yeah, I heard you, and right to the place of, that's not good. How can we fix that? Right. Yeah. And that's part, I think, of what you all are getting at in this sort of emphasis of Real Talk, is that it's not even enough just to invite the different conversation, but it is to take that next step, which is what Wesley's talking about, is the active do. Right? Don't do something and do something. And I think that's really important, because when you are in a position of privilege, I do mean that deliberately now, when you are in a position of privilege, and you become aware of what you do have and what others don't, then there is sort of an obligation to act in a way that is more towards the greater good than just your own personal.
Yeah, I think that was one of the things that, as we've been having conversation and thinking, I mean, being on Wesley's campus, right, and thinking about one of the big things for me that I took away because of such a diverse student population was, like, it's like the gospel, the good news isn't so small that it's good news for Chris, right? But it's good news for Asa and for Ben and all of our baggage and stuff and bias, and like, that starts to get mind blowing, and then to start to digest that and say, but then there's this social principles, there's this thing. Okay, so knowing that, you see that harm is being done, how do you stop and then do, has been a real catalyst for going, all right, God's big enough for everybody, but and love, that love is all encompassing. So now how do we name that, how do we own that, and how do we take those next steps?
Yeah, I like as we've been having these conversations about John Wesley's 3 Simple Rules, the circular nature of them, in that, and especially in the context of this conversation when we're talking about privilege and bias, where we see in that do no harm the idea where we can recognize the ways in which we are harming others, and sometimes not even realizing that we're doing it, and then moving into action like you were talking about, and in ways that build community and are, kingdom building actions that has that all-encompassing love like you're talking about. And then we haven't actually had the stay in love with God part of the conversation online. That's coming next week. But as we start to look into these ordinances that Wesley was talking about, and these kind of core principles of the way we live out our faith, we see those start to affect the way we recognize and realize our biases, and recognize and realize what privileges we do have. If we have some advantage, we start to be able to recognize those through introspection and worshiping together and all of those things. And so it's just one of the reasons I really wanted to have this conversation is because it's easy to say, like, well, these are just these kind of weird social concepts that we can't really put our fingers on. They're hard to define. We can talk about them, but we can't really do anything about them. And when we look at it in this way, we can really put our hands on it and touch it and feel it and mold it and shape it in a way where it can change our lives, and then start to shape the lives and change the world around us in transformational and really powerful ways. So that's just I really love this series and this talk and this concept for that reason, because it's just so practical.
Yeah, right. It's the idea of something that Lovett Weems, who's a retired professor of leadership here, used to always say about church leadership, and that is assume grace until proven otherwise. Right. And so I think if we start from the position in all of our sort of challenging conversation is that I don't have the right answer, right? And my position is not the correct position. And that if that's a safe assumption, right, if you're going to go into any conversation, then you're going to assume that you don't have the best information. Right. And in the conversation, the way you approach the conversation like that is one of information and engagement and asking deep probative questions. Something that I've heard said many times by a good friend of mine is that community begins with questions, right? So we start hard conversations with good questions, right? And then the questions allow for information to flow more freely. And it's not an interrogation, but it is an investigation.
Right.
So that we're really beginning to explore where we are and where we fit in all this. And I think once we have that information, then we can start taking more deliberative action. But in almost all of those situations, it calls us for more questions about ourselves.
Right.
Yeah.
Another way of saying what you're talking about, that introspective work that kind of yields what's my responsibility at the next level. So.
I think that, I was thinking as we were talking, that kind of same thing is that we start with grace, and then church planner language when we're cultivating relationships, right? It's that you have to ask people to barbecue with you before you go on vacation together.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so if we're willing to listen and ask those questions, the folks in my life that I have invested that kind of time with, who I'm trying to get either suss out my own bias or just seek understanding, and I've done that groundwork with, I can ask questions that to anybody else would be the most offensive, dumb questions, right?
Mm-hmm.
That, like, I know that I don't know, and I'm just say, I know that you are a safe person, and we've done the work, so you know my motives, but I don't know how to put this any other way.
So I'm just going to say it.
Say it, and please be gracious.
Right.
And in those moments of putting yourself out there, of being honest and transparent in that way, instead of me going, I don't know how to do this, or this seems too big, or there seems to be too many issues, or I don't want to do more harm, say, well, I've done this groundwork.
Right.
And so now we can take that step forward together. It's powerful.
Yeah.
Cool.
Awesome. Well, before we wrap the conversation up, do either of you have any last little things you want to add?
Final thoughts?
Yeah, final thoughts.
No, again, I think this is a really important conversation to have, and particularly at this time in our society where we've lost a sense of common engagement on nearly every part of our life together. This is the opportunity to realize that we're the problem collectively. We are. And so how do we do that? We get out of that by being collectively the solution. And there's some hard steps that we have to do, but I think if we're willing to be courageous, then you take it, like all things in discipleship, you take it one day at a time. Yeah.
Awesome.
Cool.
Well, thank you so much to both of you for,
great.
especially you, Asa, for joining us in this conversation, taking some time out of your day to sit with us. I appreciate that a lot. We are going to be continuing this conversation in the chat with whatever's going on now. We're not just going to shut it off when we shut the camera off. We'll keep the chat open until the end of the hour so that we can keep the discussion going. If you have something on your mind that you want to share or just want some feedback on, we can also use the FaithPoint Online Facebook group for that, which is facebook.com/groups/FaithPoint Online. If you are not a member of that group, it is a closed group, but it's open to everyone. So just, join the group and I'll approve you and get you in there so you can be a part of the conversation. But the same rules apply for the conversation that we had here during our discussion tonight, apply there, where we're not going to be punks. We're going to come at each other with grace first. So we want to continue that conversation. If you have questions, if anything about what we've said here today is challenging or made you uncomfortable, or you just want to, go, either way, whatever it is, please just jump into the discussion somewhere and be a part of it. We'd love to know that you are here and what this conversation meant to you. And if there are new questions that spring out of what we've discussed today, that would be great. So that's all I've got. Chris, if you could close us in prayer, I would really appreciate that. And then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, let's pray. God of grace, I just give you thanks for conversation, for friends around the room, and wherever we might find one another as we continue the conversation. I give you thanks for Asa's ministry and the gift that he is to all of those students and faculty and friends that he touches in ways that empower us to do that hard work that we've been talking about, God. We just ask that you continue to bless us to be courageous, to be quick to listen, and to not be shy about doing the next good thing. God of grace, we pray this in your Son's name. Amen.
Amen. All right, thank you guys, and thank you all so much again for being here. If you have any questions or feedback, feel free to email me at ben@faithpointum.org, and we will be back next week with a brand new FaithPoint Online.